My son told me I barely move anymore, so I moved his inheritance right out of his reach. What he didn't know was that this barely moving mother still had fight left in her. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. If you also believe that we still have value, even after 60, type 1 in the comments. And please, leave a like and subscribe. Let's show them we're strong together. My name is Dorothy Parker, and at 73, I thought I knew what family meant. I was wrong, dead wrong. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of my Chicago bungalow, casting familiar shadows across the hardwood floors I'd polished for 37 years. My arthritic fingers wrapped around my favorite ceramic mug, the one with tiny violets painted along the rim that my late husband Frank had given me on our 20th anniversary. The coffee was bitter, stronger than I usually made it, but my hands shook so much these days that measuring had become guesswork. I sat at the kitchen table where Frank and I had shared thousands of breakfasts, where I'd helped little David with his homework, where we'd celebrated birthdays and anniversaries and all those small, precious moments that make up a life. The wooden surface bore the scars of our history. A ring stain from where Frank always set his coffee cup, small scratches from David's toy cars, a burn mark from the time I'd set a hot pot down without thinking. My reflection caught in the chrome surface of the toaster, gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, reading glasses perched on my nose, wearing the same blue floral house dress I'd had for years. When had I become this woman? When had my hands become these gnarled, spotted things that struggled to button my clothes? When had my legs become so unsteady that I had to hold onto furniture just to cross a room? The house felt too big now, too quiet. Every morning I woke up expecting to hear Frank's voice calling from the bedroom, asking if I'd seen his reading glasses. Every evening I found myself setting 2 plates on the table out of habit, then putting one back with a heart that still ached 3 years after his funeral. But David visited regularly, or so I told myself. Once a month, sometimes twice if I was lucky. He'd breeze in with his expensive cologne and perfectly pressed suits, his phone constantly buzzing with important calls from his law firm downtown. "How are you managing, Mom?" he'd ask. But his eyes were always somewhere else, checking his watch, scanning his messages, calculating how long he needed to stay before he could leave with a clear conscience. I'd learned not to mention the loneliness, the way the silence stretched between his visits like an endless desert. I'd learned not to talk about how my groceries were getting heavier, how the steps to the second floor were becoming mountains, how sometimes I went days without speaking to another human being. David had his own life, his own problems. His divorce from Jennifer had been expensive, and starting over at 48 with a new girlfriend half his age required resources I understood I couldn't provide. This particular morning felt different, though. Heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm when all the birds go quiet and the world holds its breath. I'd been awake since 4, my joints aching with that deep, bone-deep pain that meant the weather was changing. The arthritis in my hands was particularly bad today, making it difficult to grip my coffee mug without wincing. I'd already taken my morning medications, a handful of pills that kept my blood pressure stable, managed my diabetes, and dulled the constant ache in my bones. The prescription bottles lined up on the counter like small plastic soldiers, each one representing another part of my body that was failing, another system that required chemical intervention to function properly. The phone rang at exactly 9:17 a.m. I know, because I was staring at the clock above the stove, wondering if this day would feel as long as all the others. David's name appeared on the caller ID, and my heart did that little skip it always did when he called. Maybe today would be different. Maybe today he'd ask how I was really doing, not just the polite version that didn't require him to actually care about the answer. "Hi, sweetheart," I answered, trying to keep the eagerness out of my voice. "Mom?" His tone was businesslike, the same one he used with difficult clients. "We need to talk." The words hit me like cold water. In my 73 years, nothing good had ever followed that phrase. Frank had said those exact words the night before he told me about his diagnosis. David had said them before announcing his divorce, before explaining why he needed to borrow money from my savings account for his legal fees. "Of course, honey. What's on your mind?" There was a pause, the kind of silence that stretches and twists until it becomes uncomfortable. I could hear traffic in the background, the hum of his car's air conditioning, which meant he was calling from his Mercedes on his way to the office. Even this conversation wasn't important enough to merit his full attention. "Mom, I've been thinking about your situation. My situation." As if I were a problem to be solved rather than his mother who had raised him alone after his father died of cancer when David was only 12. As if I were a case file on his desk rather than the woman who had worked 2 jobs to pay for his college education, who had sacrificed her own dreams so he could have his. "What situation is that, David?" Another pause. Longer this time. I could picture him pinching the bridge of his nose, the way he did when he was about to deliver bad news to a client. "You barely move anymore, Mom. Yesterday when I stopped by, you were still in your robe at 3 in the afternoon. The house is a mess. You're not taking care of yourself." The words landed like physical blows. Each one carefully chosen, precisely delivered to maximum effect. "You barely move anymore." As if I were furniture that had outlived its usefulness. As if the woman who had run marathons in her 50s, who had danced with Frank every Saturday night for 25 years, who had climbed mountains and traveled the world, had simply ceased to exist. "I'm managing just fine," I said, but my voice cracked on the words. "No, Mom, you're not." His voice was gaining strength now, the confidence of a man who had made his decision and was ready to defend it. "Jennifer agrees with me. We think it's time to consider your options." Jennifer, his ex-wife who had barely spoken to me during their 15-year marriage, who had made it clear from the beginning that she considered me an inconvenience in their perfectly ordered life. Jennifer, who had never thanked me for the thousands of dollars I'd given them for their down payment, for the babysitting I'd provided when their son was small, for the holiday dinners I'd cooked while she sat in my living room complaining about everything from the temperature to the food. "My options?" I repeated, though I already knew what he meant. "There are some very nice facilities in the area. Assisted living communities where you'd have people to help you, activities to keep you engaged, medical care right on site. You wouldn't have to worry about maintaining this big house anymore. Facilities, communities." The euphemisms rolled off his tongue so easily, but I heard what he really meant. He wanted to put me away, to warehouse me with other forgotten people where I wouldn't be his responsibility anymore, where he could visit once a month and tell himself he was being a good son. "David, this is my home. Frank and I built our life here. You grew up here. I'm not ready to—" "Mom, please, be practical. You fell last month and couldn't get up for 2 hours. What if something serious happens? What if you have a stroke or a heart attack? Who's going to find you?" The fall. Of course he would bring up the fall. It had been a stupid accident. I'd been reaching for a book on a high shelf and lost my balance. I'd lain on the bedroom floor for exactly 1 hour and 43 minutes, staring at the ceiling and feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. When I'd finally managed to pull myself up using the bedpost, I'd been so shaken that I'd called David immediately. Big mistake. Now every conversation came back to that moment of vulnerability, that single instance when I'd needed help and had been foolish enough to ask for it. It had become his trump card, his proof that I was incapable of caring for myself. "I have my emergency alert system," I said weakly, "which you never wear because you say it's ugly and uncomfortable." He was right, of course. The plastic device sat on my nightstand, neglected and judging. I hated the way it made me feel, like an invalid, like someone who had already given up on living and was just waiting for the next emergency to carry her away. "David, I don't want to argue about this. I'm fine here. I'm happy here. Are you, Mom? Are you really happy sitting alone in that house all day watching your stories on TV and eating frozen dinners? When was the last time you saw your friends? When was the last time you left the house for something other than a doctor's appointment?" Each question was a knife twist, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. My circle of friends had shrunk with each passing year. Some had moved away to be closer to their children. Others had died. A few had developed dementia and no longer recognized me when I visited. The ones who remained seemed to have busy lives that didn't include room for a widow who couldn't drive at night anymore and struggled to keep up with conversations. "I could come visit you every day at one of these places," David continued, his voice softening into what I recognized as his sales pitch tone. "We could have lunch together, go for walks in their gardens. You'd make new friends, people your own age who understand what you're going through. People my own age. As if being 73 meant I only had value to other 73-year-olds. As if my decades of experience and wisdom were only relevant to people who shared my exact birth year. As if I were a vintage car that belonged in a museum with other antiques, admired but no longer useful for actual transportation. I need to think about this, I said, knowing that thinking wouldn't change anything. David had already made his decision. This phone call wasn't a consultation. It was a notification. Of course, take all the time you need. But Mom, don't take too long. I worry about you. He hung up, and I sat in my kitchen holding the phone, staring at the violets on my coffee mug, remembering the woman I used to be. The woman who had raised a son alone, who had built a successful catering business from nothing, who had volunteered at the hospital and the library and the animal shelter. The woman who had mattered. When had I become this shadow of myself? When had I become someone who barely moved? But as I sat there in the morning light, feeling the weight of his words settle into my bones like arthritis, something else settled there too. Something that had been dormant for years, but wasn't dead. Anger. Not the hot, explosive kind that burns out quickly, but the cold, steady kind that builds slowly and burns forever. The kind that changes things. David thought I barely moved anymore. He had no idea what this barely moving mother was capable of when she finally decided to act. After David's call, I found myself walking through the house like a ghost haunting her own life. Each room held memories that now felt like evidence in a trial where I was both the prosecutor and the defendant. Had I given too much? Had I loved too blindly? Or had I simply raised a son who saw my devotion as weakness? The living room still held Frank's reading chair, worn leather cracked in places where his elbows had rested during thousands of evenings. On the mantel above the fireplace sat photographs that told the story of our family. Frank and me on our wedding day, young and hopeful. David's first steps, his graduation from law school, his wedding to Jennifer. But now these images felt like monuments to a different woman, someone who had believed that sacrifice equaled love, that giving everything meant getting something back. I remembered the night Frank died. David was 25 then, fresh out of law school with student loans that stretched into 6 figures. I'd been working at Morrison's Diner for 3 years, saving every tip and working double shifts on weekends to help him through college. My feet would swell so badly that I had to soak them in Epsom salt every night, but I never complained. Not once. Frank's funeral cost $12,000. The life insurance barely covered half of it. I took out a loan against the house, our house, the one we'd saved for over 10 years to buy, to give my husband the dignity he deserved in death. David never offered to help with the expenses. He said he was financially strapped from starting his career, but I noticed he drove a brand new Honda Civic to the funeral while I was still taking the bus to work. 6 months later, he called with that same tone he'd used today. "Mom, we need to talk." Jennifer was pregnant. They'd found a house in Oak Park, a beautiful colonial with a wraparound porch and a garden that Jennifer fell in love with. The down payment was $40,000, money they didn't have but desperately needed. "It's an investment in our future," David had explained, sitting at this very kitchen table, his hands folded in front of him like he was presenting a business proposal. "Jennifer's already picking out nursery furniture. We've never asked you for anything before." The lie sat between us like a third person at the table. Never asked for anything? I'd paid for his textbooks, his bar exam fees, his first apartment security deposit. I'd bought him professional clothes for job interviews and a reliable car when his old one broke down. I'd given him everything I had, and he'd taken it all without question, as if my resources were simply extensions of his own. But this was different. This was $40,000, my entire savings account, money I'd accumulated over 15 years of careful budgeting and sacrifice. Money that was supposed to be my security blanket, my protection against the uncertainties of widowhood. "I don't know, David," I'd said carefully. "That's everything I have saved." His face had changed then, hardening into an expression I'd never seen before. "Mom, you're sitting on this money while your son can't provide a proper home for your future grandchild. Is that really the kind of grandmother you want to be?" The manipulation was so skillful, so precisely calibrated to hit my deepest fears. What kind of grandmother would I be? What kind of mother hoarded money while her child struggled? I'd been raised to believe that family came first, that parents sacrificed for their children without question or complaint. I gave him the money, all of it. Every dollar I'd saved from my tips, every penny I'd scraped together from my modest Social Security benefits. I signed the cashier's check with hands that trembled, not from arthritis, but from the deep, bone-deep knowledge that I was making a terrible mistake. "You're doing the right thing," David had said, folding the check and sliding it into his wallet with practiced ease. "We'll pay you back as soon as we're established." With interest. That was 8 years ago. I'd never seen a penny of it returned, but the requests kept coming. Tommy's private school tuition when the public schools weren't good enough for their son, Jennifer's medical bills when she developed complications during her second pregnancy, car payments when David's BMW needed repairs that cost more than I made in 6 months. Each time, the same reasoning: family helped family, and I was fortunate to be in a position to help. I walked upstairs to my bedroom, my hand gripping the banister with each step. The photo albums were kept in my closet, heavy leather-bound books that chronicled our family's history. I pulled one out and sat on the edge of my bed, turning pages that felt like archaeological layers of my own diminishing life. Here was David at 5, gap-toothed and grinning, wearing the Superman costume I'd sewn for him because the store-bought ones were too expensive. I'd worked until midnight for a week, squinting under the dim light of my bedroom lamp, pricking my fingers with the needle because I was too tired to be careful. But his joy when he put it on had made every sacrifice worthwhile. Here he was at 16, standing next to his first car, a used Honda that I'd bought with money borrowed against my credit cards. He'd needed transportation to his after-school job, he said, but I later learned he'd used the car mostly to drive to parties and dates. The insurance had been expensive, the repairs frequent, but I'd convinced myself that mobility was freedom, and freedom was what every parent wanted for their child. His high school graduation picture showed him in a cap and gown, standing between Frank and me. We looked proud, exhausted, and older than our years. Frank was already sick by then, though we didn't know it yet. The cancer was growing silently in his lungs while we celebrated our son's achievements, believing that our sacrifices had purchased his success. College had been a 4-year exercise in financial hemorrhaging. Tuition, room and board, textbooks, spending money, emergency funds for unexpected expenses that always seemed to arise at the worst possible moments. I'd taken a second job cleaning offices at night, working from 6 in the evening until midnight, then getting up at 5 to start my shift at the diner. I remembered calling David during his sophomore year, exhausted after working 18 days straight without a break. "Honey, I'm struggling a bit with the bills this month. Do you think you could pick up a few more hours at your campus job?" His response had been immediate and indignant. "Mom, I can't work more hours. My grades will suffer. Do you want me to fail out of college? Besides, I need to focus on my internship applications. My future depends on making the right connections." His future, always his future. Never our future, never my future. Just his, stretching out before him like a golden road paved with my sacrifices. Law school had been even worse. The tuition was astronomical, and David had been accepted to Northwestern, a prestigious program that would open doors and set him up for life. The student loans covered most of it, but there were always extras: study materials, professional clothes, networking events, bar exam prep courses. "Think of it as an investment," he'd said during one of our increasingly tense conversations about money. "Lawyers make good money, Mom. I'll be able to take care of you when you're older. Take care of me when I'm older." The promise that had sustained me through years of financial strain and physical exhaustion. The belief that my sacrifices were building something, creating a safety net that would catch me when I could no longer catch myself. I'd believed him. God help me. I'd believed every word. Even after he graduated and started making 6 figures at his law firm, the requests continued. They were more sophisticated now, wrapped in legal terminology and business speak. Tax advantages, investment opportunities, temporary cash flow problems that would be resolved once certain deals closed. I'd co-signed the loan for their house in Oak Park. When David's divorce proceedings began, I'd paid for his attorney fees because Jennifer's lawyer was trying to destroy him financially. When his new girlfriend Ashley needed money for her business venture, some kind of online boutique that never materialized. I'd provided the startup capital without question. Each time, I told myself that this was what love looked like. This was what mothers did. They gave until they had nothing left to give, and then they found more to give anyway. But lying here in my bedroom, surrounded by photographs of a son who now wanted to put me in a facility, I finally understood the truth that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. David hadn't been asking for help. He'd been taking what he wanted, using my love as a weapon against my better judgment. Every request had been carefully calculated, timed for maximum emotional impact, delivered with just enough guilt and manipulation to ensure compliance. I'd raised a predator. My beautiful, gap-toothed little boy in his homemade Superman costume had grown into a man who saw my devotion as a resource to be exploited. The realization hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. I closed the photo album and held it against my chest, feeling the weight of all those years, all those choices, all those moments when I'd chosen his happiness over my own security. Was I used? The question whispered itself through my mind like a cold wind. Yes, I thought. Yes, I was used. Completely, systematically, relentlessly used by the person I loved most in the world. And tomorrow, he would probably call to discuss visiting assisted living facilities, believing that his barely moving mother would go quietly, gratefully, into whatever box he'd chosen for her. He had no idea how wrong he was. The week following David's phone call passed in a blur of small cruelties that I'd somehow learned to accept as normal. Each day brought new evidence of how completely I'd been erased from my own son's life, how efficiently he'd reduced me to an inconvenience to be managed. Tuesday morning, I called his office to discuss the assisted living conversation further. His secretary, a young woman named Brittany with a voice like crystallized sugar, answered on the third ring. Morrison and Associates. This is Brittany speaking. Hello, dear. This is Dorothy Parker, David's mother. Is he available? The pause was brief but telling. Oh, hi, Mrs. Parker. David's in a meeting, but I can take a message. Could you tell him I'd like to speak with him about our conversation yesterday? It's important. Of course. I'll let him know you called. He never called back. Not that day, not the next. When I tried again on Thursday, Brittany's voice carried a barely concealed edge of irritation. Mrs. Parker, David asked me to tell you that he's extremely busy this week with the Henderson case. He'll call you when he has a chance. When he has a chance. As if speaking to his 73-year-old mother was a luxury he might indulge in if his schedule permitted. As if I were a distant acquaintance rather than the woman who had sacrificed everything to make his career possible. Friday brought my weekly grocery shopping trip, a journey that had become increasingly difficult as my arthritis worsened. The grocery store that had once felt manageable now seemed designed to humiliate elderly shoppers. The aisles were too narrow for comfort, the shelves too high for someone my height to reach, the checkout lines too long for legs that ached after standing for more than a few minutes. I was struggling to reach a can of soup on the top shelf when a young employee noticed my difficulty. He was kind, barely 20, with the sort of genuine concern that made me remember when customer service meant actually serving customers. Here, let me help you with that, he said, easily retrieving the can I'd been stretching for. Thank you, sweetheart. My son keeps telling me I should ask for help, but I hate to be a bother. His smile was warm, uncomplicated. You're not a bother at all. That's what we're here for. I drove home thinking about that simple interaction, how a stranger had shown me more kindness in 30 seconds than my own son had in months. The young man hadn't sighed impatiently or checked his watch. He hadn't made me feel like a burden or an inconvenience. He'd simply helped, the way people used to help each other before everything became a transaction. Saturday was my 74th birthday. I woke up early, as I always did, and made myself a cup of coffee with extra cream, a small indulgence I allowed myself on special occasions. The house was quiet, except for the familiar sounds of morning, the refrigerator humming, the clock ticking, the heating system cycling on and off. I waited for the phone to ring. At 10 o'clock, I told myself David was probably sleeping in. He worked hard, kept long hours. He'd call when he woke up. At noon, I reasoned that he was probably taking Ashley out for brunch. Saturday was their day together, and I shouldn't expect him to interrupt his personal time. At 3 in the afternoon, I started making excuses. He was busy, distracted, dealing with important matters that I couldn't understand. Maybe he'd forgotten, but that didn't mean he didn't care. At 7 in the evening, I stopped making excuses. My 74th birthday passed without a single call, card, or text message from my only child. The son I'd raised alone, the man whose education I'd funded, whose career I'd supported, whose life I'd made possible. He'd forgotten I existed. I sat in my kitchen that night, eating a piece of store-bought cake with a single candle, and felt something crack inside my chest. Not my heart. That would have been too clean, too dramatic. This was messier, more fundamental. This was the sound of a lifetime of hope finally admitting defeat. Sunday morning brought an unexpected visitor. Jennifer, David's ex-wife, appeared at my door with Tommy, my 14-year-old grandson. It had been months since I'd seen him, and the sight of his face, so much like David's at that age, made my chest tighten with a mixture of joy and pain. "Hi, Grandma Dorothy," Tommy said, his voice carrying the particular discomfort of a teenager who'd been forced into a social situation he didn't understand. Jennifer looked uncomfortable too, shifting her weight from foot to foot and avoiding direct eye contact. "I hope you don't mind us dropping by. Tommy wanted to see you." I invited them in, bustling around the kitchen to make tea and find cookies, grateful for the company even though I could sense the visit had an agenda. Jennifer had never been particularly warm toward me, but she'd been consistently polite, which was more than I could say for some daughters-in-law. "How's school, sweetheart?" I asked Tommy, who was slouched in Frank's old chair, his attention divided between his phone and the conversation. "Fine, I guess. Dad says you might be moving to one of those old people places." The words hit me like a slap. Jennifer's face flushed with embarrassment, and she shot Tommy a warning look. "Tommy, that's not—" "It's okay," I said quietly. "David's been discussing it with me." Jennifer's expression softened slightly, and for a moment I saw something that might have been genuine concern. "Dorothy, I know this is hard. When my mother was going through something similar, it was difficult for all of us. But David's right. You shouldn't be alone in this big house. What if something happens? What if something happens?" The refrain that had become the soundtrack of my declining independence. As if living meant nothing more than avoiding catastrophe. As if the goal of existence was simply to minimize risk until death made the whole question irrelevant. "I manage fine," I said, but the words sounded hollow even to me. "Do you?" Jennifer's voice was gentle but pointed. "When was the last time you had a real conversation with someone? When did you last leave the house for something enjoyable rather than necessary?" I opened my mouth to answer and realized I couldn't. The truth was too pathetic to speak aloud. I hadn't had a meaningful conversation in weeks, hadn't done anything purely for pleasure in longer than I could remember. My life had contracted to the basic functions of survival, and even those were becoming increasingly difficult. After they left, I found myself standing in my living room, staring at the photographs on the mantel. Tommy had barely looked at me during the visit, his attention consumed by his phone and the obvious discomfort of being in his grandmother's house. Jennifer had been kind but distant, treating me with the careful politeness reserved for elderly relatives who were becoming a burden. That evening, I decided to call David. Surely he would want to know that Jennifer and Tommy had visited. Surely he would be interested in how his son was doing, even if he couldn't be bothered to check on his mother. "Hi, Mom." His voice was distracted, and I could hear the television in the background. "David, honey, Jennifer and Tommy stopped by today. It was so nice to see them." "Yeah, Jennifer mentioned she might do that." As if my visits from family members were agenda items to be discussed and approved. As if even the basic human contact I craved had to be scheduled around his convenience. "Tommy's gotten so tall. He looks just like you did at that age." The sound of channel surfing came through the phone. He wasn't even pretending to pay attention. "David, yesterday was my birthday." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. I could hear him processing this information, could almost see him checking his calendar, realizing his oversight. Oh, shit. Mom, I'm sorry. I've been so busy with this case, and Ashley's been planning this event for her business." "It's fine," I interrupted, though it wasn't fine at all. "I just thought you should know. I'll make it up to you." We'll take you out to dinner next week, okay? Somewhere nice. Next week. After he'd forgotten my birthday, after he'd relegated me to the status of a scheduling problem, he was offering to take me to dinner, as if a meal could repair the damage of being forgotten on the day that marked my existence. That's not necessary, David. Don't be silly, it's the least I can do. The least I can do. The phrase that had become his standard response to any gesture of care or consideration. As if being my son were a burden he bore reluctantly. As if every interaction with me were a debt he resented having to pay. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and faced a truth I'd been avoiding for months. I was utterly, completely alone. Not just physically alone. I'd been that since Frank died. But emotionally alone in a way that felt like slow suffocation. The son I'd raised, the child I'd devoted my life to supporting, saw me as nothing more than an obligation to be managed. Monday morning brought a phone call that would change everything, though I didn't know it at the time. The voice was professional, efficient, belonging to someone who made difficult calls for a living. Mrs. Parker, this is Sarah Chen from First National Bank. I'm calling about your account. My account? Yes, ma'am. We've noticed some unusual activity that we wanted to discuss with you. Large withdrawals that don't match your typical spending patterns. My heart began to race. What kind of withdrawals? Well, there was a transfer of $15,000 last month to an account belonging to David Morrison, and another transfer of $8,000 2 weeks ago. Do you recall authorizing these transfers? The world tilted sideways. David Morrison. My son had been using my maiden name on his accounts, which meant he had access to my banking information, which meant he had been taking money from my account without my knowledge or permission. Mrs. Parker? Are you still there? Yes, I whispered. I'm here. We also wanted to alert you that your account balance is now below $500. Given your age and the nature of these transactions, we're required to ask if you're being financially exploited. $500. My life savings, the money I'd accumulated through years of careful budgeting and sacrifice, had been reduced to $500. David hadn't just taken the money I'd given him willingly, he'd been stealing from me. I need to see my account records, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Of course. Would you like me to mail them to you, or would you prefer to come in? I'll come in. Today. The bank records told a story of systematic theft that stretched back over 2 years. Transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, payments for expenses I'd never authorized, withdrawals that coincided with David's major purchases, the BMW he'd bought last year, the vacation to Europe he'd taken with Ashley, the down payment on the condo he'd purchased as an investment property, all of it funded with money stolen from his elderly mother. I sat in the bank manager's office, staring at the papers that documented my son's betrayal, and felt something die inside me. Not hope, that had been dying slowly for months. Not love, that was more complicated, more stubborn. What died was the last vestige of the woman who had believed that sacrifice equaled love, that giving everything meant getting something back. That woman was gone. In her place sat someone harder, colder, more clear-eyed about the realities of human nature. Someone who finally understood that she had been used, exploited, and discarded by the person she had trusted most. David wanted to put me in a facility because I barely moved anymore. Well, I was about to show him exactly how much this barely moving mother was capable of moving. I called David that same afternoon from the bank parking lot, my hands steadier than they'd been in months. The clarity that comes with complete betrayal is a strange gift. It burns away all the comfortable lies and leaves only truth, sharp and unforgiving as winter wind. Mom, I'm in a meeting. You stole from me. The words cut across his professional courtesy like a blade through silk. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice carried that particular strain of someone trying to manage a crisis while maintaining plausible deniability. I don't know what you're talking about. $23,000, David. Taken from my account over the past 2 years without my knowledge or permission. The bank has records of every transfer. Another pause. This one calculating. I could almost hear him switching gears, abandoning denial for a different strategy. Mom, you're confused. Those weren't thefts. You authorized those transfers. Remember when I needed help with Ashley's business expenses and the car repairs? You said you wanted to help. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that for a moment I almost doubted my own memory. This was what he'd been doing for years, I realized. Rewriting history to make my exploitation seem like my choice, making me complicit in my own financial destruction. I never authorized anything. You've been stealing from me while telling me I'm incapable of managing my own life. You're getting paranoid, Mom. This is exactly what I've been worried about. First, you can't remember conversations. Now you're making accusations. I'm looking at the bank records right now, David. Every transfer is documented. The bank manager is sitting here with me, and she's very interested in discussing financial elder abuse laws. The quality of his silence changed. I could feel him reassessing, recalibrating his approach for a more serious threat. Mom, don't do anything rash. Let's sit down and talk about this like adults. There are explanations for everything. The explanation is that you're a thief, and I'm done being stolen from. I hung up before he could respond and turned to Mrs. Chen, the bank manager who had witnessed my entire conversation with the patience of someone accustomed to family financial dramas. I want to change all my account access immediately, I said. Remove David Morrison from everything, every account, every automatic transfer, every piece of paper that has his name on it. She nodded with professional sympathy. Of course, Mrs. Parker. We'll need you to sign some forms, and I'd recommend considering a restraining order if you feel unsafe. Unsafe. The word lingered in my mind as I drove home. I didn't feel physically unsafe. David had never been violent, never raised his hand to me, but I felt emotionally unsafe in a way that was almost worse. I'd been living in a house of cards built on lies, manipulation, and theft, and now that it was collapsing, I could see how deliberately it had been constructed. My phone started ringing before I'd even pulled into my driveway. David, of course, but I let it go to voicemail. Then Jennifer called, which surprised me. Then Ashley, a woman I'd met exactly 3 times, left a message saying we needed to clear up this misunderstanding. I listened to David's voicemail while sitting in my car, engine off, preparing myself for whatever new form of manipulation he'd devised. Mom, I know you're upset, but you're not thinking clearly. I've been helping you manage your finances because you asked me to. You said you didn't want to worry about money anymore, remember? I've been trying to protect you from making mistakes. This is exactly the kind of confusion I've been worried about. Call me back. We need to fix this before you do something you'll regret. The audacity was breathtaking. He'd stolen $23,000 from me and was now framing it as protection, as if I were a confused child who needed his financial guidance, as if my discovery of his theft was the problem, not the theft itself. I walked into my house and made myself a cup of tea with hands that barely trembled. The clarity was still there, burning away years of self-doubt and misplaced guilt. For the first time in months, I felt like myself, not the diminished, apologetic version of myself that David had trained me to be, but the woman who had built a successful catering business, who had raised a child alone, who had survived losing her husband and rebuilt her life from grief. That woman had been sleeping for too long. Now she was awake. The doorbell rang at 7:30. I knew it would be David before I opened the door, but I was surprised to see Ashley with him. She was younger than I'd remembered, probably early 30s, with the kind of carefully maintained appearance that requires significant time and money. Her presence felt strategic, as if David thought feminine solidarity might soften my resolve. Mom. David stepped forward as if to hug me, but I moved back, keeping the screen door between us. I thought we should talk, he continued when I didn't invite them in. There's been a misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding was mine, I replied evenly. I misunderstood you for an honest man. Ashley stepped forward, her smile bright and practiced. Mrs. Parker, I think there's been some confusion about the money David borrowed. He's always intended to pay you back. We've actually been discussing it recently, haven't we, David? Borrowed. As if secret withdrawals from my account constituted a loan agreement. As if theft became legitimate when you called it by a different name. I don't recall being asked for a loan, I said. I recall having money stolen from my account by someone I trusted. David's patience was beginning to fray. I could see it in the tightness around his eyes, the way his jaw clenched when he thought I wasn't looking. This wasn't going according to his script. Mom, you're being dramatic. Family helps family. You helped me when I needed it, just like I'll help you when you need it. That's how families work. Is that how families work? Because I've been needing help for months, David. I needed help after I fell. I needed help with my groceries, with my medications, with the loneliness that was eating me alive. Where was the family help then? We offered to help you find a nice assisted living facility. You offered to warehouse me so I wouldn't be your problem anymore. There's a difference. Ashley tried again, her voice taking on a tone I recognized from sales presentations. Mrs. Parker, you have to understand David's position. He's been so worried about you, trying to balance taking care of you with his own responsibilities. The money issues are just a misunderstanding, but the bigger picture is that he loves you and wants what's best for you. I looked at this woman, this stranger who was lecturing me about my own son's motivations, and felt something cold and final settle into place. Ashley, isn't it? I said quietly. How much of my money went toward your business venture? The one that never materialized? Her smile flickered. I don't think that's because the bank records show several transfers that coincide with David's mentions of your startup costs. I'm curious about the return on my investment. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. David and Ashley exchanged a look that confirmed everything I needed to know about their partnership in spending my money. Mom, you're turning this into something it's not, David said, his voice carrying a warning edge. You're sick. You're not thinking clearly. This is exactly why I've been trying to help you make better decisions. There it was. The nuclear option. I was sick, confused, incompetent. My anger was evidence of mental decline rather than justified rage at being robbed by my own child. It was a masterful manipulation, designed to make me doubt my own perceptions and submit to his authority. But I'd spent the afternoon with Mrs. Chen, reviewing bank records with the precision of a forensic accountant. I'd spoken with my doctor, my lawyer, and a social worker who specialized in elder financial abuse. I was many things, but confused wasn't one of them. I'm thinking clearly for the first time in years, I said. Clear enough to see exactly what you are, what I am. David's voice rose slightly, and I caught a glimpse of real anger beneath his calculated concern. I'm your son. I'm the only family you have left. Do you really want to destroy our relationship over money? Over money. As if the theft were a minor financial disagreement rather than a fundamental betrayal of trust. As if my objection to being robbed were petty materialism rather than a basic demand for respect. You destroyed our relationship when you decided I was something to be exploited rather than someone to be loved, I replied. The money is just evidence of what you really think of me. Ashley stepped closer to David, her hand finding his arm in a gesture that felt possessive rather than supportive. Maybe we should go, she murmured. Let her cool down. Cool down. As if my anger were an inconvenient emotion that would pass if given time, rather than a rational response to systematic abuse. David, I said as they turned to leave, I want you to know that I've changed my will. He stopped, his back still to me, and I saw his shoulders tense. Everything goes to the women's shelter on Michigan Avenue now. The house, the insurance money, whatever's left in my accounts. I thought you should know. He turned then, and for just a moment, I saw past all his careful facades to the rage and entitlement beneath. This was who he really was. Not the concerned son or the successful attorney, but a man who'd built his life on the assumption that his mother's resources belonged to him. You can't do that, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. I already have. I'll contest it. You're not competent to make these decisions. Any lawyer will be able to prove that you're not in your right mind. There it was. The threat I'd been expecting. He would use my age, my widowhood, my depression against me, painting me as an incompetent old woman whose decisions couldn't be trusted. But I'd been preparing for this conversation since I left the bank. Actually, David, I spent this afternoon with Dr. Morrison. No relation to you, just an unfortunate coincidence in names. He's administered a complete cognitive assessment, which I passed with flying colors. I've also had my mental competency evaluated by a court-appointed specialist. The paperwork is with my attorney, along with documentation of your financial theft. His face went pale. Ashley's hand tightened on his arm, and I could see her mental calculations shifting as she realized their comfortable arrangement was collapsing. "You'd rather give your money to strangers than to your own family?" David asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine bewilderment, as if he truly couldn't understand why theft might damage our relationship. "I'd rather give my money to people who will use it to help others," I replied, instead of people who see it as an entitlement. They left without another word, Ashley's heels clicking rapidly on my front walk as she hurried to keep up with David's angry stride. I watched them drive away and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. For the first time in decades, I was free from the exhausting obligation of loving someone who saw that love as weakness to be exploited. I was free from the crushing weight of trying to earn affection from someone who had already decided I was worth more dead than alive. I was free to discover who Dorothy Parker could be when she wasn't busy being David Morrison's mother. The phone rang throughout the evening. David, Ashley, even Jennifer calling to discuss the situation. I let them all go to voicemail, listening later to increasingly desperate attempts to manipulate me back into compliance. But I was done being managed, done being handled, done being the convenient solution to other people's problems. I was finally ready to start living for myself. The morning after my confrontation with David, I woke up to something I hadn't experienced in years. Silence that felt peaceful instead of oppressive. No anxiety about what he might need from me today. No guilt about disappointing him. No exhausting mental calculations about how to manage his expectations while protecting what little I had left. For the first time in decades, my morning belonged entirely to me. I made coffee the way I actually liked it. Strong, with real cream instead of the skim milk David had insisted was better for my health. I sat at my kitchen table wearing my favorite robe, the soft blue one with tiny flowers that Jennifer had once dismissed as frumpy, and watched the sun rise through my window without anyone telling me I was wasting the day. The silence of my phone felt like a gift. Usually by 8 a.m., David would have called with some request disguised as concern. Had I taken my medications? Was I eating properly? Had I remembered to lock my doors? Each call a small reminder that he saw me as incapable of basic self-care, despite the fact that I'd managed my own life perfectly well for 73 years. But today, my phone sat quiet on the counter, and I realized this was what freedom felt like. At 9:30, I did something I hadn't done in over a year. I called a taxi and went shopping. Not grocery shopping, not pharmacy shopping, not the grim errands of survival that had become my only reason for leaving the house. Real shopping, for things I wanted instead of things I needed. The driver was a middle-aged woman named Carmen who helped me into her car with genuine kindness, instead of the impatient efficiency I'd grown accustomed to from service workers who saw elderly people as inconveniences. "Where to, honey?" she asked. And I realized I didn't have a destination planned. "The bookstore on State Street," I said, surprising myself. "The big one with the coffee shop inside." When had I last bought myself a book? When had I last sat in a coffee shop simply because I enjoyed it? The questions felt archaeological, like excavating artifacts from a previous civilization of myself. The bookstore was exactly as I remembered it. Enormous, overwhelming, filled with more possibilities than any one person could explore in a lifetime. I wandered the aisles like someone returning from exile, running my fingers along book spines and remembering what it felt like to be curious about the world instead of just trying to survive it. In the biography section, I found a book about Julia Child that made me smile. I'd always admired her fearlessness, the way she'd reinvented herself at 50 by learning to cook in Paris. What would it be like, I wondered, to discover a new passion at 74? I bought the book, along with 2 novels I'd heard about on NPR, and a cookbook focused on cooking for one person. The total came to $63, money I would have agonized over spending just a week ago, when every purchase had to be justified against the possibility that David might need something. But now, spending my own money on my own pleasure felt like a radical act of self-respect. The coffee shop was busy with the usual mixture of students, business people, and retirees who had nowhere else they needed to be. I ordered a large coffee with real cream and a blueberry scone, then found a table by the window where I could watch people pass by on the sidewalk. I opened Julia Child's biography and lost myself in the story of a woman who'd found her purpose later in life, who'd refused to accept that her best years were behind her. As I read, I became aware of conversations happening around me. Discussions about books, politics, travel plans, dreams for the future. When had I stopped having dreams for the future? When had I accepted that my life was essentially over? That all I could do now was manage my decline as gracefully as possible? A woman at the next table was telling her friend about a painting class she'd started taking. "I always thought I was terrible at art," she was saying, "but it turns out I just needed to find the right teacher. Now I can't wait for Thursdays." I couldn't wait for Thursdays. The phrase stuck with me as I sat there, trying to remember the last time I'd looked forward to anything with anticipation instead of dread. After finishing my coffee and scone, both delicious, both chosen for pleasure rather than nutrition, I walked slowly through the downtown area. My legs were steadier than they'd been in months, as if the absence of constant stress had improved my physical balance along with my emotional equilibrium. I stopped at a clothing store I'd walked past hundreds of times but never entered. It was the kind of place that catered to younger women, with bright colors and modern styles that I'd assumed weren't appropriate for someone my age. But looking through the window, I saw a soft purple sweater that reminded me of the violets on my coffee mug, and I found myself walking inside. The saleswoman was probably the age my daughter would have been if I'd had one, early 40s, professionally friendly, but not condescending. "Can I help you find anything?" "I was looking at the purple sweater in the window," I said, then added impulsively, "I've never worn purple before." She smiled, and it was genuine. "Purple would be beautiful with your silver hair. Would you like to try it on?" The dressing room mirror showed me a woman I barely recognized. The purple brought out the blue in my eyes, which I'd forgotten were actually quite pretty. The cut was flattering without being too young, sophisticated without being dowdy. I looked like someone who might have opinions about books, who might take painting classes, who might have somewhere to be on Thursday afternoons. I bought the sweater, along with a pair of comfortable but stylish shoes that were nothing like the orthopedic monsters David had insisted I needed. Walking out of that store wearing my new clothes, I felt transformed in a way that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with choice. The taxi ride home gave me time to process what I'd accomplished. I'd spent a morning doing exactly what I wanted to do, without asking permission, without justifying my choices, without considering how my actions might inconvenience someone else. It was such a simple thing, yet it felt revolutionary. That evening, I called Mrs. Peterson, a neighbor I'd barely spoken to since Frank died. She was a widow too, a few years younger than me, who lived 3 houses down and always waved when she saw me checking my mail. "Dorothy?" She sounded surprised to hear from me. "How are you, dear?" "I'm well, actually. Better than I've been in a long time. I was wondering if you'd like to have coffee sometime this week." I realized I don't know my neighbors as well as I should. We made plans for Thursday afternoon. I couldn't wait for Thursday. And I hung up feeling lighter than I had in years. One phone call, one simple social connection, and already my world felt larger. I spent the evening reading Julia Child's biography while wearing my new purple sweater, occasionally glancing up at my reflection in the dark window and marveling at the woman looking back at me. She looked alive, engaged, like someone with her own agenda instead of someone waiting for other people to tell her what to do. My phone rang at 10:30. David, of course. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message while brushing my teeth. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. I think we both said things we didn't mean. Why don't I come over this weekend and we can work this out? I love you, and I don't want money issues to come between us. Family is more important than anything else." I deleted the message without a second thought. "Love," he said. But love didn't steal from vulnerable people. Love didn't gaslight and manipulate. Love didn't try to warehouse inconvenient relatives and facilities. What David felt for me wasn't love. It was ownership, and I was no longer available to be owned. That night, I slept better than I had in months. No anxiety about tomorrow's phone calls, no guilt about disappointing anyone, no exhausting mental rehearsals of conversations where I would have to defend my right to my own money and my own choices. I dreamed about Paris, about cooking classes and art studios, about trains to places I'd never been. In my dreams, I was wearing my purple sweater and had somewhere important to be, somewhere that only I knew about. Friday morning brought another small revolution. I decided to drive myself to the grocery store. I hadn't driven in months, not since David had started making comments about my reaction time and vision, but my driver's license was still valid. My car was still in the garage, and I was tired of depending on other people for basic transportation. The car started on the first try, as if it had been waiting patiently for my return to independence. The drive to the store was slow but successful, and I felt an absurd pride in accomplishing something that had once been routine. At the grocery store, I bought ingredients for meals I actually wanted to eat instead of the bland, supposedly heart-healthy foods David had insisted were appropriate for someone my age. Fresh strawberries, real butter, a bottle of wine that cost more than I usually spent on groceries in a week. I was no longer shopping for survival. I was shopping for pleasure. The young man who had helped me reach the soup can the previous week was working again, and he smiled when he saw me. "How are you doing today, Mrs. Parker?" I said. "Dorothy Parker. And I'm doing wonderfully, thank you." "You look different," he said, then blushed slightly. "I mean, you look happy." Happy. When had someone last described me that way? When had I last felt entitled to happiness instead of just the absence of immediate crisis? "I feel different," I told him. "I feel like myself again." That afternoon, I did something that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. I called a travel agency, not to plan anything specific, just to ask about possibilities. What kinds of trips were available for single travelers? What accommodations existed for people who needed some assistance but weren't invalids? The agent, a cheerful woman named Susan, seemed delighted to discuss options. There were group tours designed for mature travelers, river cruises with medical facilities on board, even art and cooking workshops in beautiful locations. "I've always wanted to see Italy," I found myself saying. "Is that realistic for someone my age?" "Absolutely," Susan replied. "We have wonderful programs specifically designed for people who want to experience Italy at a comfortable pace. When were you thinking of traveling?" When was I thinking of traveling? The question implied that I had agency over my own schedule, that I could make plans based on my own desires rather than other people's availability. "Maybe in the spring," I said, surprising myself with the definitiveness of it. "I'd like to see the countryside when everything is blooming." I made an appointment to discuss details the following week, and hung up feeling giddy with possibility. Italy. In spring. Because I wanted to go, and because I could. That evening, Mrs. Peterson called to confirm our coffee date. "I'm so glad you reached out," she said. "I've been wanting to get to know you better, but I wasn't sure if you were interested in company, if I was interested in company. All these months I'd been starving for human connection while my neighbors assumed I preferred solitude. How many opportunities for friendship had I missed because I'd been too wrapped up in trying to manage David's expectations to notice the world around me? "I'm very interested in company," I told her. "I'm realizing I've been hiding from life for too long." As I hung up, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror. Purple sweater, silver hair combed nicely, eyes bright with something that might have been hope. I looked like a woman with plans, with possibilities, with Thursdays to anticipate. For the first time in years, I looked like someone I might want to know. The house felt different now. Not empty, but peaceful. Not lonely, but private. It was my space, shaped by my choices, responsive to my needs instead of someone else's judgment. I was 74 years old, and I was just beginning to discover who I might become. The intervention came 3 weeks later, orchestrated with the precision of a military operation. I was enjoying my Thursday afternoon coffee with Mrs. Peterson. We'd become fast friends, sharing stories about our late husbands and dreams we'd thought were behind us. When I saw them through my kitchen window, David's Mercedes pulled into my driveway, followed by Jennifer's SUV and a car I didn't recognize. They emerged like a delegation, their faces set with grim determination. David carried a folder thick with documents. Jennifer held what looked like printed emails, and the stranger, a woman in her 50s wearing a conservative business suit, clutched a briefcase like a shield. "Oh my," Mrs. Peterson said, noticing my expression. "That looks serious." "It's about to be," I replied, feeling that familiar calm settle over me. The same clarity that had carried me through the bank meeting, through David's theft, through all the small revelations that had rebuilt my understanding of my own life. The doorbell rang with unusual persistence, as if urgency could compel compliance. I opened the door to find David flanked by his support team, all of them wearing expressions of carefully rehearsed concern. "Mom, we need to talk," David said, stepping forward without invitation. "This is Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a geriatric psychiatrist. We've asked her to evaluate your recent behavior." A psychiatrist. The nuclear option, just as I'd expected. They were going to try to have me declared mentally incompetent, to prove that my resistance to their control was evidence of cognitive decline rather than justified anger. "How thoughtful," I said, not moving from my doorway. "Did you also bring a lawyer to explain why stealing from elderly people is suddenly legal?" Dr. Mitchell stepped forward with professional smoothness. "Mrs. Parker, I understand you're upset about some financial matters. Your family is concerned that stress might be affecting your judgment. Perhaps we could sit down and discuss." "My judgment is fine, Dr. Mitchell. It's fine enough to recognize a setup when I see one." Jennifer moved closer, her voice taking on the particular tone she used when talking to Tommy about his homework. "Dorothy, we're all here because we love you. We're worried about the changes in your behavior, the accusations you've been making. This isn't like you. This isn't like you." The phrase that had haunted me for months. The suggestion that any deviation from passive acceptance was evidence of mental deterioration. But they were right. This wasn't like the old me. The old me would have invited them in, offered coffee, apologized for causing trouble, and allowed them to gaslight me into compliance. The new me had different plans. "You're right, Jennifer. This isn't like me. The old me would have let you continue stealing from me while pretending it was love. The old me would have been grateful for the privilege of being robbed by my own family." David's patience was fraying. I could see it in the tightness around his eyes, the way his grip on the folder had turned his knuckles white. "Mom, you're being paranoid and delusional. Dr. Mitchell has reviewed your case, and she agrees that you're showing signs of cognitive decline that require immediate intervention." "My case?" I looked at Dr. Mitchell with new understanding. "You've already diagnosed me without meeting me? Based on what evidence?" Dr. Mitchell's professional composure slipped slightly. "Your son provided information about your recent behavioral changes, your accusations of theft, your sudden decision to change your will. These can be indicators of what? Of an elderly woman finally standing up for herself? Of someone refusing to be exploited anymore?" I turned to David, and for the first time in our conversation, I let my anger show. "You told her I was delusional, didn't you? You painted me as a confused old woman who was imagining things." "You are imagining things," David said, his voice rising. "You're seeing conspiracies where there are none, making accusations that don't make sense. The money transfers you're complaining about were authorized by you. You're just not remembering clearly." "Then you won't mind if Dr. Mitchell reviews the bank records I've brought," I said, producing a folder of my own, along with the documentation from my attorney and the reports from the 2 independent psychiatric evaluations I've had done. The silence that followed was profound. David's face went pale, and I saw Ashley emerge from the passenger seat of his car, clearly having been instructed to wait, but unable to resist witnessing the confrontation. Dr. Mitchell took the folder with professional curiosity, her demeanor shifting as she scanned the documents inside. Bank statements showing unauthorized transfers, legal documentation of my cognitive competency, psychiatric evaluations that declared me not only mentally sound, but remarkably resilient for someone who'd experienced systematic financial abuse. "Mrs. Parker," Dr. Mitchell said slowly, "these documents tell a very different story than what I was led to believe." "I imagine they do." I looked at David, whose careful facade was finally cracking. "Would you like to explain to Dr. Mitchell how you've been systematically stealing from me for 2 years while telling everyone I was too mentally incompetent to manage my own finances?" "That's not what happened," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're twisting everything. You asked me to help manage your money because you said it was too complicated." "When?" I interrupted. "When did I ask you to help? What date? What conversation? Because I have no memory of ever giving you permission to access my accounts, and the bank has no record of any authorized transfers. Jennifer stepped forward, her role apparently being to provide emotional manipulation when legal intimidation failed. Dorothy, even if there were some irregularities with the money, we can work that out. The important thing is that you're safe and cared for. We found a beautiful facility where you can visit me twice a year and tell yourselves you're being good family members, I finished. Where I'll be someone else's problem, warehoused with other inconvenient relatives while you spend whatever's left of my money. Ashley chose that moment to join our little gathering, her presence adding an extra layer of surreal theater to the proceedings. Mrs. Parker, I think you're being unfair. David has been trying to take care of you. Ashley, isn't it? I turned to face her directly. The business venture that never materialized, the one funded with $8,000 of my money, how did that work out for you? Her face flushed, and she looked to David for support. But David was staring at Dr. Mitchell, who was still reading through my documentation with increasing professional interest. Mr. Morrison, Dr. Mitchell said carefully, these psychiatric evaluations indicate that your mother shows no signs of cognitive impairment. In fact, they suggest she's been under considerable stress, possibly from what the evaluating psychiatrist describes as systematic emotional and financial manipulation. Those doctors don't know her like I do, David said desperately. They don't see her on a daily basis. They don't know about the confusion, the forgetfulness, the way she's been living in that house alone. You mean the way I chose to live in my own house, spending my own money on my own life? I interrupted. The way I refused to be grateful for being robbed? Dr. Mitchell closed the folder and looked at David with professional disapproval. Mr. Morrison, I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding about your mother's condition. Based on these evaluations and my brief interaction with her, I see no evidence of cognitive decline that would justify involuntary commitment or guardianship proceedings. The words hit David like physical blows. Involuntary commitment. Guardianship proceedings. The legal machinery he'd been preparing to deploy against me, now revealed in all its calculated cruelty. You came here planning to have me declared incompetent, I said, the full scope of their plan becoming clear. You were going to use this doctor's evaluation to take legal control of my life. We were trying to protect you, Jennifer said weakly. From what? From making my own decisions? From refusing to be stolen from? From having the audacity to expect basic respect from my own family? I walked to my mantelpiece and picked up a photograph. David's graduation from law school, all of us smiling in the sunshine, believing we were celebrating the beginning of his success rather than the end of our relationship. I kept this picture on my mantel for 15 years, I said, holding it up for everyone to see. I was so proud of you, David. So proud of the man I thought you'd become. I walked to the fireplace and threw the photograph into the cold ashes. The glass shattered with a sound like breaking promises. But that man never existed, did he? The man I was proud of was just a story I told myself to justify the years of exploitation and manipulation. Mom, don't. David started forward, but I held up my hand. I'm not your mom anymore, David. Mothers are supposed to be loved, not robbed. Mothers are supposed to be respected, not declared incompetent when they refuse to be victimized. I turned to Dr. Mitchell, who was watching the scene with the fascination of someone witnessing a textbook case of family dysfunction. Doctor, I want you to know that I've arranged for copies of all my documentation to be sent to the state board that licenses geriatric psychiatrists. I'm curious about the ethics of diagnosing someone without meeting them. Based solely on information provided by someone who had clear financial motives for wanting that person declared incompetent. Dr. Mitchell's face went pale. Mrs. Parker, I was operating under the assumption that the information I received was accurate. Of course you were. Just like David operated under the assumption that stealing from his elderly mother was somehow justified. I looked at each of them in turn. David, Jennifer, Ashley, Dr. Mitchell. All of them complicit in their own ways in the systematic destruction of my autonomy and dignity. I want all of you to leave my house, I said quietly. David, you are no longer welcome here. You are no longer part of my life. You are no longer my heir, my emergency contact, or my problem to solve. "You can't do this," David said, his voice cracking. "I'm your son. I'm your family." "Family doesn't steal from each other," I replied. "Family doesn't lie to doctors to have their relatives declared incompetent. Family doesn't warehouse people in facilities when they become inconvenient." I opened my front door and stood beside it, making my expectations clear. "You have 5 minutes to leave my property before I call the police and have you removed for trespassing." They filed out like a defeated army. Their carefully orchestrated intervention collapsed into chaos and mutual recrimination. I could hear them arguing in my driveway, David blaming Dr. Mitchell for not doing her job, Jennifer defending her role in the conspiracy, Ashley suggesting they consult another psychiatrist who might be more cooperative. But their voices were already fading into background noise. They had no power over me anymore, no ability to manipulate or control or diminish me. I had taken back my life, my money, my dignity, and my right to make my own choices. Mrs. Peterson appeared at my side, having witnessed the entire confrontation from my kitchen window. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked gently. I looked at the broken photograph in my fireplace, at the empty driveway where my son's car had been, at the woman in the purple sweater reflected in my hallway mirror. "I'm better than all right," I said. "I'm free." That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened a bottle of wine and toasted my own courage. The house felt different now. Not empty, but spacious. Not lonely, but peaceful. It was truly mine again. Responsive to my choices rather than shaped by other people's expectations. I was 74 years old, and I had finally learned the difference between being alone and being lonely, between being abandoned and being liberated. Tomorrow, I would call Susan about that trip to Italy. Tonight, I would celebrate the fact that I had somewhere to go, something to look forward to, and a future that belonged entirely to me. 3 months after the confrontation, I stood in my bathroom mirror applying lipstick. Real lipstick, not the pale, apologetic colors I'd worn for years, but a bold coral that made my eyes sparkle and my skin glow. Today was the day I'd been planning for weeks, and I wanted to look like the woman I'd become rather than the shadow I'd been. The woman in the mirror was a revelation. Silver hair styled in a modern cut that framed my face instead of hiding it. The purple sweater had been joined by other pieces in colors I'd never dared wear. Emerald green, deep blue, even a soft yellow that reminded me of spring mornings. But more than the clothes, it was my posture that had changed. I stood straighter, took up more space, moved through the world like someone who belonged in it. The taxi arrived at precisely 10 a.m. I'd hired Carmen again. She'd become my regular driver for special occasions, and today definitely qualified. In the back seat sat a small suitcase and my passport, both symbols of the life I was building for myself. "Airport?" Carmen asked, though she already knew the answer. "Airport," I confirmed, settling back into the seat with a satisfaction I'd never felt before. "I'm going to Italy." Italy. The word still felt magical on my tongue. Impossible in the best way. 6 weeks of art workshops in Tuscany, organized by a company that specialized in travel for mature women who wanted to discover new passions. I'd be staying in a converted monastery, learning to paint watercolors, eating food prepared by local chefs, and sharing the experience with 15 other women who'd decided their lives weren't over just because their children had grown up. The month since David's failed intervention had been a masterclass in rediscovering myself. It had started small. That coffee with Mrs. Peterson had led to weekly walks through the neighborhood, which had introduced me to other women who'd been invisible to me during my years of obsessing over David's needs. Margaret from 2 streets over, who'd started a book club after her husband's death. Susan, who lived in the apartment complex near the library and had been looking for someone to go to matinee movies with. Elena, a 78-year-old former teacher who'd begun volunteering at the Literacy Center and needed help with their fundraising events. Suddenly, my calendar was full of choices instead of obligations. Tuesday book club meetings where we discussed everything from mysteries to memoirs. Thursday afternoon movies where we could comment on the plot without annoying anyone. Saturday morning walks that had evolved into brunches at cafes I'd never known existed. Wednesday evening volunteer work where I used the organizational skills I'd developed running a catering business to help adults learn to read. Each activity had been a small revelation about who Dorothy Parker could be when she wasn't busy being David Morrison's mother. I was funnier than I'd remembered, more opinionated, more curious about other people's stories. I had strong feelings about books and movies, passionate opinions about local politics, and a talent for organizing events that brought people together. The Literacy Center had been particularly transformative. Working with adult students who were learning to read had reminded me that it's never too late to acquire new skills, to change the trajectory of your life through determination and courage. Maria, a 60-year-old immigrant who'd hidden her illiteracy for decades, had finally learned to read her grandchildren's school reports. James, a construction worker whose injury had forced him to find new career options, was now reading technical manuals and planning to become a safety inspector. Watching their faces light up as words began to make sense had awakened something in me that had been dormant for years. The desire to be useful for my own reasons rather than someone else's convenience. I'd started teaching basic computer skills to seniors, helping them navigate online banking and social media so they could stay connected with distant family members. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was helping other people maintain family relationships while cutting ties with my own toxic son. But it was my painting that had surprised me most. What had started as a casual interest, sparked by overhearing that conversation in the coffee shop, had evolved into a genuine passion. I'd enrolled in a beginner's watercolor class at the community center, expecting to produce embarrassing amateur sketches. Instead, I'd discovered I had an eye for color and composition that had been waiting 74 years to be discovered. My first painting had been of my coffee mug, the one with the violets that Frank had given me. Simple, tentative, but recognizable. My instructor, a patient woman named Claire, who specialized in teaching art to older adults, had encouraged me to keep exploring. "You see details that other people miss," she'd told me. "That's not something you can teach. That's a gift. A gift." At 74, I was still discovering gifts I didn't know I possessed. The paintings had progressed from simple still lifes to landscapes, portraits, even abstract pieces that expressed emotions I couldn't put into words. My kitchen wall now displayed a gallery of my work, a visual diary of my transformation from victim to artist. The colors had grown bolder as I'd grown more confident, the brush strokes more decisive as I'd learned to trust my instincts. The Italy trip had been Claire's suggestion. "You've outgrown what I can teach you here," she'd said after critiquing my latest landscape. "You need to see the light in Tuscany, to learn how the masters captured it. You need to paint where Michelangelo and Da Vinci painted." The idea had seemed absurd at first. Women my age didn't just decide to study art in Italy, but then I'd realized that women my age was a limitation I'd imposed on myself, not a truth about what was possible. I'd called Susan at the travel agency the same day. As Carmen navigated the airport traffic, I thought about the goodbye I'd had with Mrs. Peterson the previous evening. She'd become more than a neighbor. She'd become the sister I'd never had, the family I'd chosen rather than inherited. "I'm so proud of you," she'd said, tears in her eyes as we sat on my front porch sharing a bottle of wine. "When I first met you, you seemed so diminished, like you were apologizing for taking up space. Now look at you, traveling to Italy to study art like you're 25 instead of 74. "I feel 25, I'd admitted. "Well, maybe 35. I feel like I have a future instead of just a past." The check-in process at the airport was easier than I'd expected. The airline staff were helpful without being condescending, treating me like a traveler rather than a potential liability. I'd worried about navigating the airport alone, but I moved through security and found my gate with a confidence that surprised me. While waiting to board, I called Elena to let her know I'd arrived safely at the airport. She was coordinating the Literacy Center's fundraising event while I was gone, and I wanted to make sure she had everything she needed. "Dorothy, stop worrying about us and focus on your adventure," she laughed. "We managed just fine before you came along, and we'll manage while you're painting your way through Tuscany." But her words reminded me of something important. I was needed here, but not in the desperate, exploitative way David had needed me. These women appreciated my contributions without taking them for granted. They valued my skills without seeing them as entitlements. They had built relationships with me based on mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. The flight to Rome was my first international travel in over 20 years. Frank and I had talked about seeing Europe together, but there had always been something more pressing: David's education, the business, the house repairs that couldn't wait. Now, looking out the airplane window at the Atlantic Ocean below, I realized that someday was a luxury I could no longer afford. At 74, someday was now. My seatmate was a woman about my age traveling alone to visit her daughter in London. We spent the flight sharing stories about our children, our marriages, our discoveries about who we were becoming in our 70s. Her name was Ruth, and she'd been widowed for 5 years. Like me, she'd spent the initial years of widowhood trying to be useful to her adult children, only to realize that being useful wasn't the same as being valued. My daughter used to call me every week, Ruth told me as we shared airline cookies over the Atlantic. But the conversations were always about what I could do for her: babysitting, cooking for her family, helping with household projects. When I started saying no sometimes, started making my own plans, the calls became less frequent. "Do you miss the calls?" I asked. Ruth considered this seriously. "I miss the illusion that I was important to her, but I don't miss feeling like a convenience store, always open, always stocked with whatever she needed, never valuable for my own sake." Her words crystallized something I'd been thinking about for months. David's version of love had been transactional. I was valuable to him only as long as I was useful. When I'd stopped being useful in the ways he preferred, when I'd started asserting my own needs and boundaries, his interest in maintaining our relationship had evaporated. Real love, I was learning, didn't disappear when it became inconvenient. The friends I'd made, the relationships I'd built based on mutual interest and respect, didn't require me to diminish myself to maintain them. They celebrated my growth rather than feeling threatened by it. The monastery in Tuscany was everything I'd hoped and more. Built in the 15th century, converted to an art retreat in the 1990s, it offered comfortable accommodations and buildings that had housed contemplatives for centuries. My room was simple but beautiful. Stone walls, wooden beams, a window that looked out over olive groves and rolling hills that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. The other women in the program were revelations. Sarah, a retired professor from Boston who'd always wanted to paint, but had never found time between teaching and raising 4 children. Margaret, a former nurse from Seattle who'd discovered art therapy after her husband's death from Alzheimer's. Linda, a grandmother from Phoenix who'd sold her house and was spending her inheritance on experiences rather than leaving it to children who'd already made it clear they saw her primarily as a future financial resource. We were 15 women ranging in age from 62 to 81, all of us discovering that creativity didn't have an expiration date, that passion could be cultivated at any stage of life. Some had been painting for years. Others, like me, were relative beginners. What we shared was the courage to prioritize our own growth over other people's expectations. The first week was intensive. Morning lessons in the monastery's converted chapel, where natural light streamed through tall windows and illuminated our easels like altars to creativity. Afternoon sessions in the gardens, learning to capture the interplay of light and shadow on ancient stones. Evening critiques where we shared our work and discoveries with the supportive honesty of women who'd moved beyond the need to compete with each other. Our instructor was a local artist named Giovanni, who spoke excellent English and had infinite patience with students who were learning to see the world through artists' eyes. "You are not too old to learn," he told us repeatedly. "You are old enough to have something to say. That is the difference. Old enough to have something to say." The phrase became my mantra as I painted landscapes that captured not just the physical reality of the Tuscan countryside, but the emotional reality of my transformation. The colors I chose were bold, decisive, the purples and corals and deep blues of a woman who was no longer apologizing for taking up space in the world. By the end of the first week, I had produced 3 paintings that Giovanni described as promising. By the end of the second week, I had one he called exceptional, a watercolor of the monastery at sunset that captured the golden light that made everything in Tuscany look like it was painted by divine hands. But more than the paintings, I was creating a new version of myself, a woman who woke up each morning excited about the day ahead, who approached challenges with curiosity rather than fear, who connected with other women through shared interests rather than shared suffering. On our last evening, the 15 of us sat in the monastery's courtyard sharing wine and stories about what we'd learned. The conversation ranged from technical discoveries about color mixing to profound realizations about the relationship between creativity and identity. I spent 40 years believing that being a good mother meant disappearing into my children's needs, Margaret shared. Coming here, learning to paint, has reminded me that being a whole person makes me a better mother, not a selfish one. I wish I'd discovered this sooner, Linda added, but maybe I needed to be this age to have the courage to put myself first without feeling guilty about it. As I listened to their stories, I realized that each of us had made a similar journey, from self-sacrifice to self-discovery, from obligation to choice, from surviving to thriving. We'd all learned that it was never too late to become who we were meant to be. The flight home was bittersweet. I was excited to share my experiences with Mrs. Peterson and my other friends, to hang my new paintings in my kitchen gallery, to continue developing the skills I'd discovered in Tuscany. But I was also sad to leave the magical cocoon of the monastery, where creativity was the highest priority, and personal growth was celebrated rather than questioned. As the plane descended into Chicago, I looked out at the familiar skyline and realized I was returning to a life that was completely different from the one I'd left, not just because of the trip, but because of the woman who had taken it. I was no longer Dorothy Parker, David Morrison's disappointing mother. I was Dorothy Parker, artist, friend, volunteer, traveler, a woman with her own agenda and her own adventures. I had finally learned the difference between being needed and being valued, between being useful and being loved. And in learning that difference, I had discovered something even more important. I could love and value myself, regardless of how others chose to see me. At 74, I was just getting started. 1 year later, I stood in the gallery of the Chicago Community Arts Center, watching strangers admire paintings that bore my signature in the bottom right corner. The opening reception for Late Bloomers Art After 70 was more successful than any of us had dared hope, with red dots appearing next to several pieces as the evening progressed. My watercolor of the Tuscan monastery hung in the center of the display, illuminated by soft gallery lighting that made the golden sunset I'd captured seem to glow from within. Below it, a small placard read, "Monastery at Sunset, Dorothy Parker, age 74, watercolor on paper." Age 74. A year ago, those numbers would have felt like a limitation, a reminder of everything I was supposedly too old to attempt. Now they felt like a badge of honor, proof that creativity has no expiration date. "Mrs. Parker?" A young woman approached with a notebook and camera. "I'm Sarah Chen from the Tribune. Could I ask you a few questions about your work?" A reporter. At 75, I was being interviewed about my art by the Chicago Tribune. The irony wasn't lost on me. David had always been the one who might make the news. With his law practice and his professional achievements, I'd been the supporting character in his story, never imagining I might have a story worth telling myself. "Of course," I said, smoothing my emerald green dress, another bold color choice that would have seemed impossible during my years of self-imposed invisibility. "Your artist's statement mentions that you didn't start painting until age 73, Sarah said, consulting her notes. "What inspired you to begin so late in life?" Late in life. The phrase still stung, carrying the assumption that 73 was the end of something rather than the beginning. But I'd learned to reframe it. "I prefer to think of it as right on time," I said. "I spent most of my adult life taking care of other people. My husband, my son, anyone who needed something from me. It wasn't until I was alone that I discovered I had needs and talents of my own worth exploring." That's quite a shift in perspective. What changed? I considered the question, looking around the gallery at the other artists whose work was displayed alongside mine. Margaret, the retired nurse, stood beside her series of paintings inspired by her late husband's battle with Alzheimer's. Beautiful, heartbreaking pieces that transformed grief into art. Linda, the grandmother from Phoenix, was explaining her abstract expressionist works to a collector who seemed genuinely interested in purchasing several pieces. I realized that love and exploitation can look very similar from the outside, I said finally. I spent decades believing that sacrifice equaled love, that being needed meant being valued. It took me 73 years to understand the difference. Sarah scribbled notes rapidly. Can you elaborate on that? When someone loves you, they want you to grow, to discover your potential, to become the fullest version of yourself. When someone exploits you, they want you to remain useful, manageable, grateful for whatever scraps of attention they provide. The words felt revolutionary even as I spoke them. A year ago, I would never have articulated such thoughts, would never have trusted my own perceptions enough to call David's behavior what it was. Now, these truths felt as solid and undeniable as the paintbrush in my hand. Your son, Sarah said carefully, is he supportive of your artistic pursuits? I smiled, recognizing the delicate way she was probing for family drama without being invasive. My son and I no longer have a relationship. He found it difficult to accept that I was a person with my own needs and boundaries, rather than simply a resource for him to manage. That must have been painful. It was, I acknowledged, but staying in that relationship would have been more painful. Some people can only love you when you're useful to them. When you stop being useful in the ways they prefer, you discover what that love was really worth. A man approached with a glass of wine and a warm smile. Mrs. Parker? I'm James Rodriguez from the Cultural Foundation. We're organizing a group show next spring featuring mature artists. Would you be interested in participating? Would I be interested? 6 months ago, I would have been too intimidated to consider such an opportunity. Now, I found myself genuinely excited by the possibility. I'd be honored, I said, shaking his hand with the confidence of someone who no longer needed to apologize for taking up space in the world. As the evening progressed, I found myself surrounded by people who wanted to discuss my work, my technique, my plans for future projects. The attention felt surreal but genuine. These weren't polite inquiries from people trying to manage an elderly relative, but authentic interest from strangers who saw value in what I'd created. Mrs. Peterson arrived fashionably late, wearing a stunning navy blue dress and beaming with pride. Dorothy, this is incredible. I knew you were talented, but seeing your work displayed like this, she gestured around the gallery with obvious emotion. Thank you for encouraging me to take that first art class, I said, hugging her tightly. I might never have discovered this part of myself without your support. Nonsense. The artist was always there. You just needed permission to let her out. Permission. Such a simple concept. Yet it had taken me decades to understand that I didn't need anyone else's permission to pursue my own interests, to spend my own money on my own dreams, to prioritize my own growth over other people's convenience. As the reception wound down, I found myself alone with my paintings, studying them in the dim gallery lighting. Each one told a story of transformation, from the tentative still life of my coffee mug to the bold landscape of the Tuscan countryside. They were a visual diary of my journey from victim to artist, from obligation to choice, from surviving to thriving. The drive home through familiar Chicago streets felt different now. This was still the same city where I'd raised David, where I'd mourned Frank, where I'd spent years feeling invisible and unimportant. But I moved through it now as someone who belonged, who had contributions to make, who had a future worth planning for. My house welcomed me with warm light and the quiet satisfaction of space that truly belonged to me. The kitchen walls were covered with paintings now, my gallery of personal growth, each piece marking another step away from the woman who had once accepted crumbs of attention as if they were love. I made myself a cup of tea in my violet-painted mug and sat at the kitchen table where David had once informed me that I barely moved anymore. The irony was exquisite. I'd never moved more in my life. I was moving through art galleries and airplane terminals, through new friendships and creative challenges, through a life that expanded rather than contracted with each passing year. The phone rang, and I smiled when I saw Elena's name on the caller ID. The Literacy Center had become more than volunteer work for me. It had become a community of people who understood that learning never stops, that it's never too late to acquire new skills or discover hidden talents. Dorothy, how did the opening go? Elena's voice was warm with genuine interest. Better than I ever imagined. I sold 3 paintings, and I've been invited to participate in another show next spring. That's wonderful. You must be so proud. Proud. The word resonated deeply. I was proud, not of being useful to someone else, not of successfully managing other people's expectations, but of having the courage to pursue my own dreams despite everyone who told me I was too old, too late, too unimportant to matter. I am proud, I said. I'm proud of finally learning to value myself the way I always valued others. After we hung up, I walked through my house, looking at the space I'd created for myself. The living room where I read books I chose because they interested me, not because someone else recommended them. The bedroom where I slept peacefully, without anxiety about tomorrow's requests or demands. The studio I'd created in Frank's old den, where canvases and brushes waited for my next creative experiment. This was what freedom looked like. Not the absence of responsibility, but the presence of choice. Not isolation, but the ability to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. I thought about David sometimes, wondered if he ever reflected on what he'd lost when he chose exploitation over love. But those thoughts no longer carried the weight of grief they once had. He'd made his choice, just as I'd made mine. The difference was that my choice had led to growth, community, and creative fulfillment, while his had led to the loss of a mother who would have loved him unconditionally if he'd ever learned to see her as a person rather than a resource. The next morning brought another small miracle, a letter from Italy. Giovanni, my art instructor from Tuscany, was organizing a summer workshop for his most promising students. Would I be interested in returning to continue developing my skills? Would I be interested? I laughed out loud at the question. At 75, I was more interested in life than I'd been in decades. I had paintings to create, friendships to nurture, places to explore, skills to develop. I had a future that stretched ahead of me like a blank canvas, full of possibilities I'd never dared imagine. I walked to my easel and began mixing colors for my current project, a portrait of Mrs. Peterson that captured not just her physical appearance, but the warmth and wisdom that made her such a treasured friend. As I worked, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The woman who had once believed that sacrifice equaled love had learned that real love celebrates growth rather than demanding diminishment. The mother who had once thought her value lay entirely in her usefulness to her son had discovered that her worth was inherent, not earned. The widow who had once felt invisible had found ways to make herself seen that had nothing to do with other people's needs and everything to do with her own authentic expression. I'd learned that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be, never too late to stand up for yourself, never too late to choose growth over safety, authenticity over approval, self-respect over the exhausting pursuit of love from people who see you as nothing more than a convenient resource. Most importantly, I'd learned that the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to disappoint people who never really loved you anyway. As I painted, the morning light streaming through my studio window, I felt the deep satisfaction of a life reclaimed, a future chosen, a self finally, fully discovered. At 75, I wasn't winding down. I was just getting started. And that, I realized, was the most beautiful masterpiece of all. Have you ever lived through something similar? Or known someone who has experienced this kind of family betrayal? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe to this channel. Sometimes these messages need to reach exactly the person who needs to hear them most.